Hello, I'm Westchester County Executive George Latimer. I'm here to celebrate and acknowledge the importance of human rights on this special day. Back in October, I signed the Anti-Discriminatory Harassment Bill passed by the Westchester County Board of Legislators. When I signed this bill into law, we did away with any further reference to other and ensure that there's only a we in our county. Westchester is very diverse, and we should embrace any of those differences that may exist between us. I stand together with each and every one of you, solidifying our message that harassment and discrimination must end in Westchester County. This year, we're celebrating 21 years of the Westchester County Human Rights Commission, and I want to compliment our current Executive Director, Tejas Sanchala, for all of his outstanding work, he and the team that's with him. This commission was created in 1999, and I had the good fortune to be there alongside Andrea Stewart Cousins, now our Senate Majority Leader, and the late, great Lois Bronze, who were the heart and soul of this creation. And what we accomplished in those days now has been amplified by everything that has come since. We celebrate this day, and we acknowledge our progress as we continue to work to change hearts and minds of people in our communities on this very difficult of days, very polarizing days. Race is not a taboo topic. We should talk about it and work together to honor our differences, to learn from each other, and to move forward.
Thank you, County Executive Latimer, for all your support, and welcome everyone to the Westchester County Human Rights Commission's 2021 celebration of Human Rights Day. My name is Tejas Sanchala, and I am the Commission's Executive Director. My pronouns are he, him, his. And although the pandemic doesn't allow us today to get together in person, I'm excited for the wonderful program we have for you today. We have some incredible presenters that I will talk about in a moment. But first, for those who do not know, this is the 21st year that the Commission's been serving the public by combating hate and discrimination in all of their forms and by bringing the diverse people of our county together. The pandemic has opened the eyes of many to the individual and systemic forms of discrimination in our country. Nationally, we've seen a rise in xenophobia and scapegoating, with a substantial increase in discrimination targeting Asian Americans. The country's reflexive impulse to blame someone, anyone, for the impacts of the pandemic have had a negative and even deadly results. Additionally, during the pandemic, we've seen racial and gender inequities in multiple areas, including in access to healthcare and in employment. Time has proven that the Commission's work is more important now than ever before. This year, it is against this backdrop that the Commission has sharpened its tools to fight hate and discrimination at home in Westchester County. One way we've done so is to strengthen both the county's human rights law and its fair housing law. The fair housing law was amended to require cooperative housing corporations to, among other things, provide rejected applicants with a written reason for the rejection. This provision is intended to provide greater transparency during the purchase process. A recent study in nearby Long Island showed that approximately 50% of African-American testers were racially steered from certain neighborhoods towards certain other neighborhoods. Sadly, housing discrimination is alive and remains rampant today. Also, as the county executive mentioned, the human rights law was recently amended to provide individuals in Westchester County with a viable avenue of justice to fight back against instances of hate when they are attacked or intentionally harmed by another person because of their race, gender, religion, or any of the 16 protected categories under the county's human rights law. This provision protects generally against incidents involving street harassment, neighbor-on-neighbor harassment, to just name two. In this manner, the county's law goes beyond the protections offered under the state's human rights law. These strengthened laws will allow the Commission to accept an even greater number of complaints and requests for assistance from the public. I joined the Commission in 2019 as its Executive Director, and the number of complaints have increased every year. And in addition to accepting, investigating, and adjudicating complaints of discrimination, the Commission engages in a robust education outreach campaign to combat hate and discrimination and to connect the community and its leaders with resources. After the murder of George Floyd, the Commission launched an education and empowerment series to combat racism and hate. We've hosted multiple bystander intervention training workshops to help provide the community with tools on how we can all be upstanders and stop hate and harassment when we see it and to call it out. We've also organized the Solidarity Building Workshop to build bridges between different communities and to develop unity. In all, there were over 10 programs in our education and empowerment series. In today's program, will continue in those footsteps and help you build your toolbox further. We will focus on giving you actionable steps to build bridges by having the difficult conversations on race, discrimination, and hate, and finding common ground with those around you. The commission's chair, Reverend Doris K. Dalton, will kick us off and introduce New York State Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins. It is an honor that the Majority Leader is able to join us today. And then award-winning journalist and television host Celeste Headley and I will go into a conversation, talk about how to speak to our friends, family, and neighbors about race and how to have those difficult conversations in a productive manner. Ms. Headley is the author of the fantastic new book, Speaking of Race, Why Everybody Needs to Talk About Racism and How to Do It. And finally, the Commission's Vice Chair, Reverend Dr. Stephen Pogue, will deliver closing remarks about living during these polarizing times. I will now turn the program over to Reverend Dalton for her remarks. I wish you all peace, kindness, and prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you, County Executive Latimer. I appreciate your kind words, and I am thankful for your generous advocacy and support for the Westchester County Human Rights Commission. Now, friends, I am the Reverend Doris K. Dalton, and it is my privilege to serve you as the chair of the board of the Westchester County Human Rights Commission. On behalf of all members of the board, I welcome you to this event celebrating Human Rights Day in Westchester County. For 21 years, the board members and the staff of the commission have worked to ensure that all residents of Westchester are able to experience dignity and respect as they live, learn, play, and work. No matter your nation of origin, your ethnicity, your gender identity or gender expression, your sexual orientation, your ability, your religion, or residential status, you are welcome here and you belong here. Yet our work is not complete without upstanders and community builders, without justice seekers and peacemakers, without bridge builders and barrier breakers, such as yourselves. We are stronger Westchester when we stand in solidarity with one another, when we look out for one another, when we show love and compassion to one another, and when we are courageous for one another. Friends, join us because this work is not over yet. Now, it is my honor to introduce you to the State Senator Andrea Stewart Cousins. She is the Majority Leader of the New York State Senate, and she breaks barriers as the first Black female Majority Leader and through her advocacy and work in human rights across the state. In fact, it was Senator Andrea Stewart Cousins, County Executive George Latimer, and the late Lois Bronze, who worked together when they were county legislators to write and pass the landmark legislation that created the Westchester County Human Rights Commission. We are their living legacy, and we are all the better for it.
Hi, I'm Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins, and I'm so honored to be addressing the Human Rights Commission of Westchester County on its 21st anniversary. The Human Rights Commission holds a very special place in my heart as one of the first legislative accomplishments I secured as a county legislator over 20 years ago. I initially ran for office on the belief that every individual, no matter their background, is entitled to inalienable human rights. I saw firsthand the long-term impacts that discrimination and bias have on a person's life. I grew up in New York City public housing. My father, a decorated veteran, was denied GI Bill benefits on the basis of race. And I've sat with family members and friends who've encountered police brutality. As a young Black mother, I had to navigate racism, discrimination, and inequality. Not only was I forced to advocate for myself, but also for my children. These experiences galvanized my run for office and pushed for justice on behalf of those who don't have a platform. I promised that I would always lift as I climb, to clear a path for those who came after me. My goal in passing Westchester's first set of human rights laws and establishing the commission was to take an unequivocal stance on the importance of these provisions. No person living in this county or this country should ever question the legitimacy of their rights. Unfortunately, we've not yet established a world completely free of hate and discrimination. But we have made tremendous strides in offering better protections and legal recourse for those who experience these atrocities. Human rights are like any other aspect of democracy. If we don't use them, we lose them. By continuously advocating for the expansion and enforcement of these laws, we signal to the rest of our community that we aren't backing down on these fundamental protections. As we continue to grapple with the unrest that permeates our world, I wish you strength in your work at the Commission. Your efforts bring a greater degree of safety and dignity to the people of Westchester, and for that, I am truly grateful. I promise to continue the fight in Albany for more equitable laws, greater social justice initiatives, and to guarantee that every New Yorker can live freely in their own skin. Recently, I stood firmly with the governor's office when she announced an additional $25 million for the Securing Communities Against Hate Crime program, and led our conference in enacting the Hate Crimes Analysis and Review Act. I was also proud that the legislature was able to provide $10 million to groups in the Asian American community to help combat the rise in hate crimes against this population. In 2019, we passed the landmark Bill Gender, which prohibits discrimination based on gender identity or expression and includes offenses regarding gender identity or expression under the hate crime statute. Last year, we championed the New York State Crown Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of natural hairstyles and hair. And earlier this year, we passed a comprehensive package to combat housing discrimination, which included fair housing testing, implicit bias training, and improved oversight. These steps are important and allow us to build towards greater reforms. Thank you all for your invaluable work. You truly make our community better off. And I wish you all a peaceful and warm holiday season and look forward to another year of action on behalf of all New Yorkers. And again, happy 21st anniversary.
We are very excited today that Celeste Headley is joining us for this year's virtual Human Rights Day program. Ms. Headley is an award-winning journalist, professional speaker, and author of a new book, Speaking of Race and Why Everybody Needs to Talk About Racism and How to Do It. It's such a well-researched book, and it's incredibly timely, as in November and December, we're having community gatherings, family dinners, and family events. And the book provides a lot of concrete tools and examples on how to have difficult conversations with our friends, our family, and our neighbors. Ms. Headley is a regular guest host on NPR and American Public Media. She is a highly sought-after consultant advising companies around the world on conversations about race, diversity, and inclusion. Her TEDx talk, Sharing 10 Ways to Have a Better Conversation, has over 26 million views. I highly encourage you to watch that 12-minute clip on YouTube after you watch this program. Ms. Headley is the recipient of the 2019 Media Changemaker Award. She's the proud granddaughter of composer William Grant Still, the Dean of African American Composers. And with that, I will get started. I have a lot of ground I want to try to cover in a short time period. Thank you again, Celeste, for being here. And I want to start off talking about the importance of identity. When my wife, who identifies as Indian American, and her family moved from Queens to Long Island in the 1980s, I think her first day at school, she was asked, "What are you? Are you Black?" Most of the kids at the school had not seen somebody who was not white. You mentioned in your book how that is one of the worst questions you can ask somebody. Can you talk about your experiences with identity? I know you self-identify as being Black and Jewish.
Yeah, I can empathize with your wife. What are you is one of the most common questions I've been asked over the course of my life. And I mean, I think if you listen carefully to that question, you can understand why it's wrong. I'm not an object. I'm a human being. There is this desire, and this is especially true in the United States, to be able to categorize people immediately. This is one of the things that makes us so interested in kind of figuring out what someone's racial identity is, because we have this idea that if you know what someone's racial identity is, that tells you something about them. And it doesn't. Right? Like, you knowing whether someone's Black or Jewish or not doesn't tell me what their politics are or what kind of life they lead. But this is the delusion we all have. Identity for me has been a journey because look at my features. I'm racially nondescript. People can't tell what I am. And when they do guess, most people think I'm Dominican. So I have always had to answer that question. I've been thinking about that question since a very, very young age. And it's been a journey of evolution to figure out how I identify, but more it was finding the self-confidence to realize that I'm the one that gets to choose my identity. Nobody knows what upbringing I have had. They have no idea how I grew up, what my histories are, my habits, my rituals, my traditions. And so I'm the one that gets to decide what identity I claim and how I identify myself. And that's it. No one else gets to tell me whether I'm Black enough or whether I'm Jewish enough. I get to decide that for myself.
I mean, that's so true. I mean, in your book, you talk about where somebody will say they try to rationalize a statement. Well, of course you think like that because you identify with this racial group. And, that's wrong on multiple levels that you just talked about. I want to see if we can move into some of the points in the book. And during this time, people are often shouting down each other, not having a civil discourse. And I think the quote in your book that really struck me is it talks about debates don't change minds, but conversations can change hearts. Let's start with this jumping off point. Who needs to start having conversations about race? Is it one particular group? Can you talk a little bit about who should have these conversations?
Yeah, and I'm going to refer to the subtitle, which is why everybody needs to talk about race, which is that the people who are talking about race are not the people who need to talk about race always. It needs to be everybody. Very often it's people of color talking about race, and coming from a family of color, we talk about race all the time within our own communities where we feel safe, where we don't feel like there's a chance we're going to be disrespected or insulted. And very often if I'm among groups of white people, they avoid it completely, right? It's not polite conversation. So both of those dynamics need to change. We need to have many, many more cross-cultural and cross-racial dialogues, the very ones that we're the most afraid of. There's a difference in what's causing that fear, but we still need to have them. There's so much sociological and psychological research showing that one of the most powerful ways to change people's hearts about racism and racial difference is through contact. Human contact with another person who belongs to a different race. And that's sort of what we're avoiding right now. It's very difficult to deny. Some people do deny it, but it is very difficult to deny that there's not a global problem with racism. Of course there is. And so we all need to talk about it, the whole globe.
So I think that's a very important point, that the points in your book would be helpful for everyone and for us to start having these conversations. But are there some things that we should think about before we have a conversation on race? Are there some factors or some considerations? Maybe people who don't feel comfortable with it, or they do acknowledge it's difficult to have these conversations. What are some things people should think internally before they start embarking on having these conversations?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's really what I decided to start the book, because your mental preparation before you go into this is the most important thing. And I say that because one of the things that prevents, especially white people, excuse me, from having these conversations is fear of being called racist. So I just want to lay that out there, that that's not the worst thing that people can call you, because yes, you are racially biased. Of course you are. Everyone is. And by that, I mean, every human being makes assumptions about other people based on their appearance. We all do that. And when we study this in the lab, we know that one of the very first things that people notice about one another is their perceived race. So yes, you do see race. You do make assumptions about other people based on race. So let's set that fear aside. Being called a racist is not the worst thing that could happen to you. You can come back from that. The other thing is that understanding that everybody is biased should allow us to have a little bit more patience with other people's mistakes. Understanding that maybe you don't make mistakes based on racial demographics, but you do make mistakes based on somebody's perceived income or their educational level, or maybe their weight. which is one of the most common biases that there is. So you do make mistakes. Maybe someone is not pointing them out to you all the time, but we can do this mental preparation in advance of realizing that we're all sort of in this place and in it together. That can help us to be a little bit more patient with one another.
I think that's a really important point in terms of thinking about you. You can't let the fear of saying something wrong hold you back. And I like this line that you talk about. There are two types of people: one who has said something wrong about race, and others who will say something wrong about race. None of us are perfect, and none of us are expected to solve racism in one conversation. I want to move on to chapter 4 of your book, where you talk about when it worked. And you talk about, and I think it's quite brilliant, about the examples of how people's perspectives can change, and showing Derek Black and Christian Piccolini, who are both former members of hate groups. The chair of the Human Rights Commission, I had the privilege to meet Derek Black last year. And if you could talk a little bit about how conversations on race played a role in their journey, moving outside of a hate group to being anti-racist.
Derek Black was the very first interview that I did for this book. He was the first person I reached out to because he's so wonderfully honest and clear in explaining not only where he was and the false assumptions he made about others, but exactly what happened that changed his mind. And he's extremely clear in saying, this was not, a sudden realization on my part. Some didn't argue me into submission with all of their facts and data and statistics. And in Christian's case as well, nobody debated him into the ground. It was a slow, incremental change that happened over years in both of those cases because of these interactions with other people who were different from them, but in which they made some kind of empathic bond. Christian talks about people coming into his store and telling their stories about the people they loved, their children, and him feeling, yeah, me too. I feel that way too, even though you're Black and I'm white, you're a race that I hate. And for Derek, he had the two-pronged attack, right? He went to this college. He went there believing he was going to convince others to come to his point of view. That's what he believed. And there was a Jewish student who wouldn't give up on him and invited him to the Seder dinner every Friday night and told everyone, do not mention his membership in a hate group. We're not going to talk about it. So that's one way of attacking is the right wrong. That's one way of addressing this is by just only making that human connection and not talking about that elephant in the room. And the other one was this young girl who was like, I'm not going to let this go. I'm just going to keep asking you questions and telling you to explain yourself. And between these two things happening over a long period of time, he eventually changed his mind. And one of the things I wanted to do in that chapter on when it has worked was to relieve some of this pressure we have that we think that in the course of this one conversation with a racist or whomever we think is racist, that we need to change their minds. And so we're going at them with our data and our facts. And I just want everyone to know that the data isn't going to help you, right? Oftentimes a racist's beliefs aren't logical at all. They're emotionally based. So you're bringing logic to an emotion fight. Like this is a fight that's not logical. It's emotional. It's about feelings. It's about memories. It's about values. And that's the kind of connection that you need to make. Your statistics won't matter.
Oh, and I think that's really important about the empathy. And I do understand, it really did strike me when I read the story of Derek Black's journey about how Allison used open-ended questions. Say, why do you believe this? What are the reasons? And Matthew just built a bridge for empathy, but that wasn't a popular decision. When he invited Derek to Shabbat Seder on Friday nights for salmon teriyaki, people were upset. But I think that was really important to just say, let's talk about something else and let's build that connection. And then we can start talking about, they didn't talk about race right away.
Right. Eventually, once some basis of trust and connection had been established so that Derek could feel that he wasn't coming in there to be ambushed. You know, and this is one of the things that people say to me all the time is like, so I'm never supposed to mention that they're racist? I'm like, you are, but you can't come out of the gate with it because you're just going to drive them away. Maybe you're like, well, I'm principled, and that's great, except it doesn't work. So what's your goal here? Is your goal to stick by your principles that you've decided, or is your goal to actually make a difference? Right? I mean, that whole thing of spouting off all your statistics, yelling at people, telling them they're worse than Nazis or whatever it may be. If that aligns with your principles, great. But is it moving the needle? Is it changing anything? And that's super important that none of that change happened until trust was established.
And then when that trust was established, at that point, Allison Gornick was able to have conversations and say, so what is the reason you believe in the eugenic studies? What is the reason? And he believed in a lot of outdated studies that obviously are not based in fact or reason. But if they started off with that question, they wouldn't have gone anywhere.
And interestingly, another thing that Derek said, what has really stuck with me, I think one of the questions I asked him was, what advice do you have for someone else who is going into this conversation with a similar person? And he said, you need to know their position as well as you know your own. So they aren't going to give you any credibility or respect if you're arguing with them based on an incorrect understanding of what they believe. So you need to have asked enough questions about their beliefs that you fully understand their point of view and where they're coming from. And then you can have the conversation. Then you can question it. But until you establish that credibility, they're not going to have the respect in you as a conversationalist to really change their minds.
So let's talk about some of the tips in the book. In the book, you talk about there's 11 tips on how to have these conversations. And over the past year and a half, the Human Rights Commission's put on bystander intervention training workshops to empower the community and to give them tools when they see hate and harassment. And a lot of that requires practice, so you don't f up in the moment. And I think some of the tips in your book are similar. They're going to come through repetition, practice, and being aware of it. We talked a little bit about just one now and finding common ground. But could you talk about a couple of the tips in the book that might be helpful for some of the people who are listening on how to have these conversations?
I love that you are giving training in bystander interventions because we all need to be intervening. And intervene is a perfect word for this. Another word I would say is interrupting. So we hear what we call microaggressions, those statements that are relatively minor. They are usually come out of like what's called a benevolent racism, rather than overt or hostile racism. It's not a great term for it, but that's what psychologists call it. Excuse me. So let me give you a mnemonic that might help you remember how to interrupt a microaggression, and it's STAR. The STAR system is stop, tell, assist, restore. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to interrupt that statement. You're going to try to prevent the sentence from reaching a period, right? And that doesn't have to be brilliant. You just have to say something like, wait, what? Or hold on a minute, or what did you say? Or whoa, or whatever it is, you just need an interruption to stop it. Then you're going to tell. You're going to say, I don't agree with that. I don't see it. I see it differently. I find that inappropriate, or we don't say things like that here. That's all that second step is. The third step is assist. And it's very important that you keep this framework that you are being helpful here rather than dunking on them. Dunking on them, it may make you feel good for a second, but again, it's not helpful. All you're doing is making them defensive. So your mindset is that I'm assisting them. I'm going to say, I'm going to stop them. Whoa. I'm going to tell them I find that inappropriate. Then I'm going to assist them by saying, I think that's inappropriate. It upsets me when you say that about all Asian Americans. I know that not to be true. And so it bothers me that you're making this generalization about Asian Americans. That is extremely harmful. It leads to all kinds of other things. And the last step is restore. And essentially, you are restoring their humanity. Keep in mind that these, what I was saying earlier, that these changes of mind don't happen all at once. They happen over time. So it's very much in your best interests to make this interaction not be awful and dreadful for that person. You want them to be willing to engage in the future in order for there to be a possibility of eventual change. So when you restore their humanity, you're going to say something like, I know you to be a fair-minded person. I know you to be someone who tries to be inclusive. And so what you just said struck me as odd. It doesn't match what I know about you. And that's it. That's all you have to say. That takes a total of maybe a minute. And if they want to engage with you further on it, you can. But in terms of intervening, that bystander intervention that you're talking about, it is so important that we all do this, and very much especially white people. And I say that not because of any guilt or anything like that. It's only because research shows us that the most persuasive people on these issues are not people of color, it's white people. And the most persuasive of all times, the most credible and the least likely to be punished for speaking up are white men. So I don't see that as a duty or a burden. I see that as an opportunity. Like, our white brothers and sisters, they really have power here to make change. And so every single time something is said that is possibly offensive, possibly hurtful, you totally have an opportunity to make real change simply by interrupting it.
Now, what your story now about the STAR technique reminds me of a story or an anecdote you tell in the book about a conversation with your neighbor, and your neighbor generalized something about all African Americans or all people. Could you talk a little bit about, because I think that's a good example of the STAR technique that you just talked about.
Yeah, so he said, Black people don't understand the Republican position. That's why they rarely vote Republican, something like that. Or they don't understand what's going on. And I said, well, that's interesting. What Black people do you know well? And he was like, I mean, I guess just you. And again, I don't know him that well. I mean, he doesn't know me very well. So that tells you something. But then I said, so do you think I don't understand the political issues? Do you think I'm coming from a place of ignorance here? And he's like, no, of course not. And I was like, well, so the only Black person that you know is not misunderstanding the political views. So what does that tell you? Right. And it was just, I wasn't attacking him. I wasn't saying, wow, that's super racist. I was just walking him through using those questions you were talking about earlier, open-ended questions, to lead him to his own conclusions. Direct persuasion, external persuasion, where I'm persuading you, is very ineffective. It almost never works. Self-persuasion, where I'm persuading myself because I've had a thought that doesn't align with what I believed before, that is extremely effective. And that you can do through these small interactions, through your questions, through your curiosity. You can help to spark that self-persuasion.
And that conversation you had with your neighbor could have been about any topic. It was just,
absolutely,
it was generalizing. I want to talk about a common mistake that people make in conversations on race. And quite frankly, people make these mistakes in difficult conversations across the board, is they do something that you call switch tracking. And so when something starts to get a little difficult, then I'll let you talk a little about what switch track is. So maybe some of the listeners can say, oh, do I do that? Maybe there's some things that I could adjust.
Yeah, this is something that I learned about actually when I was getting my certificate in negotiation at the Harvard Business School. So this is a really common negotiation technique to deflect a subject you don't want to talk about by switching over to another. You're switch tacking. So someone walks in and goes, wow, it's really hot in here. And they say, oh, I like your haircut. Right? You're not going to actually deal with what it is that they just said. I give an example, I think, in the book of an employee coming in late and the boss saying, hey, you're late. And she says, well, but David has been late, every day for the past 2 weeks. She's switch tracking. The thing at issue is that she's late that day, and she's moving it on to there possibly being a separate standard for David. Another way that this arises in discussions about race is when a person of color says Black Lives Matter and the white person says all lives matter. You're switch tracking. Black Lives Matter means right now in our society where Black people are more likely to die, Black mothers are more likely to die during and after childbirth, where Black people are at much higher risk of dying at the hands of police, et cetera, et cetera. That creates the reality that Black lives are less protected in our society. You're saying all lives matter, which is objectively true, but it's a completely different subject. Switch tracking is when you're moving away from this subject you don't want to talk about, that Black people are less safe in our communities, which is an objective truth. You don't want to talk about that. Maybe it makes you feel guilty. I'm not sure why, but you don't want to talk about it. So you instead say all lives matter. This happens all the time. It happens in fights with your partner or your coworkers, where they come home and you say, hey, dinner's ready. And you say, I already ate, right? And they say, why would you eat when you had dinner? And you say, why would you make spinach? I don't even like spinach. You're switch tracking. This is extremely common.
And it goes against the A in the star because you're not assisting in the conversation.
Right.
You're going against it. This is a conversation I've had with a number of people lately, and I think we've touched on it, but I want to make sure we hit it. Is, I've got this crazy uncle, I've got this crazy aunt, and they espouse extremist views or what I believe to be racist views. I'm just not going to engage with them. They're out of my life. I'm not going to talk to them anymore. And that's a hard decision, but I'm just going to cut them out of my life. You really make a strong point that that's the wrong decision to make. Could you talk a little bit about why that's the wrong decision and take it from?
I mean, first of all, I want to say I understand it. It's sometimes, having to be exposed to views that are racist and demeaning to other people, that takes a toll. And we know, even through research, we know that being exposed to that kind of racism, it takes an emotional toll. So number one is, I get it. I understand it. But I want to just make this other case, which is that for a person who has racist beliefs, the person who has the best chance of changing their mind is someone that they are close to and who resembles them. And that's you, right? So if you are ostracizing them, generally what you're doing is you're just releasing them to the world to spread those racist beliefs and inflict that on most probably people of color. I'm not saying you're responsible for their behavior. I'm just saying you actually have a chance to make a difference, and maybe try it rather than avoiding it. Now, if that means, look, the most I can do emotionally is 5 minutes. That's all I can take with this person. Then give them the 5 minutes, right? Say, hey, listen, this book will help you learn how to not turn it into an argument. I promise you it will. And B, at the end of 5 minutes, when you start to become overwrought, when you start to feel stressed, you can say, you know what, we're not going to agree. Thank you for engaging with me on this, but let's move on to another subject. And you can set the boundaries for what you are capable handling, what you are willing to endure. One thing I do not ever suggest that you endure is any kind of abuse, any kind of threat. If somebody starts to become aggressive or anything like that, obviously you need to end the conversation and possibly get out of there. But that's not the kind of conversations most of us are going to have. Statistically speaking, most of us are dealing with what's known as a casual racist, not a hostile racist. In that chapter that you were talking about when I was talking about people who are members of hate groups like Derek Black, I do not recommend you talk to somebody who's a member of a hate group. Like, that requires very specific training that can be quite dangerous. But when you're talking about like your racist Uncle Bob, you're probably safe. So if all you have is 5 minutes, give me the 5 minutes. At whatever holiday it is, Thanksgiving and Christmas, you give them 5 minutes each. So 10 minutes a year. If that's all you got, give me the 10 minutes, because there is a chance that you can make a difference.
So that's a really great segue to our next question. So I've had a conversation with somebody and I've messed up. What can I do is there a way to reignite the conversation or to repair the harm in the conversation that the other person believes has occurred.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing you do is you just apologize immediately. When somebody points out that you have said something wrong, what they're basically saying is, oh, you just hurt me. What you said just hurt me. Now, I want you to put this in the context of if you're walking through your office and somebody says, ow, you just kicked me. Do you turn around and go, no, I didn't? Or that shouldn't have hurt you. That, you shouldn't have been hurt by that. I barely touched you, right? Or I was just kidding. No, you don't. You just say, I'm sorry, right? I'm sorry. Because I'm sure you didn't really mean to hurt someone else's feelings. It is not our job to decide what other people should be upset about. They're coming from their own experience. So we have no way of knowing what kind of things in their past and their experience make them sensitive to certain things. I bet you if you ask yourself, well, there's some things I'm sensitive to that I don't particularly like or enjoy or that make me feel upset, I bet that's true of other people. When you screw up, you apologize. Done. No excuses, no explanations. You simply say, I'm sorry. Now, at that point, you can ask them, may I ask you about this? Can I talk about this? I'd like to understand more about how what I said was hurtful. And they have the right to say no. So often we use, this is especially true of people of color, we use them as our Google search. And we start asking them questions about these topics and having them do our research for us. Not realizing, perhaps, I hope not realizing, that talking about these things can be traumatic, right? I mean, I woke up this morning and opened up Twitter, and trending on Twitter was Joseph Mengele, who of course was the sadistic Nazi doctor. And it's because people were comparing Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institutes of Health to Joseph Mengele. And I asked myself, how many people who actually lost someone in the Holocaust are making this comparison, right? Ask me, don't tell me what I should be sensitive about. I lost family members to the Holocaust. So don't tell me if I should be sensitive about it or not. I'm telling you I'm sensitive about it. I mean, again, it strikes me as so odd that we are always trying to decide what other people should be upset by or what they shouldn't, but we don't ever ask that about ourselves, right?
No, I mean, what you're talking about is you're really delegitimizing someone's lived experiences.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we've got a couple of questions left before our time runs out. I want to talk about the topic that a lot of people struggle with. We've talked about face-to-face conversations at the dinner table with your neighbor. What happens in a conversation online, on social media? You kind of just touched upon about what's trending on Twitter. You talk a little bit in the book about whether it's wise to engage in these types of conversations online versus face-to-face.
Yeah, and the answer is it's not wise to engage. We actually know quite a bit about what happens to the brain and the body when you are engaging with someone through what's known as digital mediation, which is any type of screen. And that we know that because social media is not all that different from email. And so we've been studying the brain on email for decades now, right? Like we've had email for a very long time. So there's a few things that we know about it. When you are engaging with others socially through a screen, you are less likely to be cooperative. You are less likely to be compassionate. You are more combative. You're more likely to escalate conflict. And then we know that when you're engaging over social media, engaging over social media pushes you to the extremes of that spectrum, whatever the spectrum may be. So you're not at your best when you're on social media. And that's also true of everybody else. Now, social media has its uses. It's extremely good for announcing an event or giving people information or linking to an article. Straightforward information exchange, social media is great. It's great for setting up, finding, hey, who's interested in this particular book club? Let's all join. Making connections, great. Any kind of nuanced conversation should not be done through email or social media. That's not my opinion. We know that. We know what the brain looks like when it's doing both things. And that needs to happen either in person or on the phone.
And that's, unfortunately, a lot of people, that is the method a lot of people communicate today about. And So I want to touch finally on one topic that we talked about identity and we talked about intersectionality. Do you have any thoughts on how to build solidarity between different community groups? At the Human Rights Commission, we recently had a solidarity building workshop between the Asian American community and the African American community to combat the false narrative that the majority of attacks against Asian Americans are being perpetrated by African Americans nationwide. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on that?
The best way to build solidarity is through storytelling. So when you get communities together and you allow each other to tell your stories, and I'm hearing this story about Asian American communities, and one of my friends who is Pakistani American started to talk about the attacks that occurred in their community after 9/11. And this led another one of my friends who is a Korean American to talk about how afraid she was for her grandparents recently because of all this racism associated with COVID-19. And she was afraid that they weren't safe. And I, inside my head, resonated with both of them. I could understand that. I understand, coming from a mixed race family, and my grandparents got married in the 1930s when it was still illegal, when mixed race families were being dragged out of their homes and their homes burnt to the ground. I understand what that's like, to be afraid for the people that you love. So this shared storytelling, when we allow someone to tell their story and we can find a connection with that, that's one of the best ways to build solidarity. The Black Panthers created the Rainbow Coalition in Chicago, in which they brought together the Hispanic community, and they also brought together some of the poor white community as well. And they did it by saying, I don't care if you like me, but the issues we care about are the same. So let's set aside whether we like one another and find these issues. We're all worried about housing. We're all worried about job insecurity, etc. And let's work together on that. That's finding resonance between the things that you care about.
And that's one of the themes in your book about commonalities and finding the commonalities that bind us together. And with that, I want to say thank you for your generosity. Thank you for your insight and for your time today. Our conversation, I hope, provided people with some tips and tools on how to engage in these conversations. They can find more in your book. And before we close out, I'm going to ask if you could read a short passage from your book on page 233.
Sure. Okay. If we can find empathy, if we can understand one another better, this could be a positive turning point for us. It could be the beginning of a new era. Many people are searching for hope, and I assure you, you will find that hope in other human beings. People are better than you assume. They are more than stereotypes. You will rediscover inspiration and optimism and confidence in other people, but you must see them as people, and you must hear them out.
Thank you so much. And as you said, everyone has more power than they realize to change perspectives, to fight racism by simply speaking up and starting the conversation. I want to say thank you for your time, and I will now turn it over to the Commission's Vice Chair, Reverend Dr. Stephen Pogue, for his closing remarks. Thank you so much, Celeste.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We hope that this program has been one that has been informative and one that has lifted your awareness to the remembrance of each of us having the ability to understand one another. There's a saying that working together works. And if we are ever going to stop living in a polarized community, then we are going to have to learn how to work together. It is so important that we take time to learn about each other's culture, about each other's race, about each other's religion, about the differences of each other, because it's really our differences that bring us together. We're definitely living in a time of differences, and we have to choose sides, and this side or that side, Republican and Democrat, male, female, whatever it is. We are so busy trying to defend our side that we miss opportunities to learn about what makes each other unique and what makes us different. It is that uniqueness, is that difference that will draw us together. There's power in coming together. There's a power in making sure that we can stand for each other in these polarized times. that no matter what it is, that your cause can be my cause, and your cause and my cause, that we can share together in these different causes and understand that we are in this together. When we understand that we are in this together, there's a power that will help eliminate racism. There's a power that comes together that will eliminate others trying to infiltrate the power of coming together. We have to get to a place in our society, in our community, in our county, where we realize that we must make those uncomfortable who make others uncomfortable. We have to set the atmosphere to remind people that just because somebody is different doesn't mean they deserve to be treated any less than a human being. So it's important, my brothers, my sisters, friends, that we come together and stand strong, that we would come against polarization. We don't need to be separated. We need to come together. So I need to understand you. You need to understand me. And it's that foundation of understanding that will get us to a place of love and care and mutual respect across race, religion, gender, all types of things. Because when we come together and remind ourselves that the thing that is important about each and every one of us is that we're human beings. And so we have to make atmospheres uncomfortable for racism. We have to make atmospheres uncomfortable for anti-Semitism. We have to make the atmosphere uncomfortable for those who have issues with people of color and people of gender and races and religions of all kinds. We have to make them feel uncomfortable, that they would never want to come and try to cause division when all we're really trying to do is come together. And that's what's so important about the Westchester County Human Rights Commission, that we try to build a strong foundation of coming together and building and understanding and mutual respect, that I may not understand everything about your culture, but that does not mean I don't want to learn. And you may not understand everything about my culture, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't want to learn. We have to get rid of the fear and the doubt of approaching somebody and say, just tell me and explain to me so I can get an understanding. I may never fully understand it, but we'll be able to get a grasp of each other's culture, a grasp of each other's background, and be able to move forward and end polarization and bring each other together, because there's power when we work together. It's been a pleasure of being with you tonight, and thank you so very much for having me. And may God continue to bless each and every one of us as we continue to move forward and do what's needed to be done as we bring people together. Thank you.